Whether you prefer to lead elite operatives in games of Kill Team, or lead a larger army into battle in games of Warhammer 40,000, claustrophobic, close-quarters combat in the depths of the 41st millennium Space Hulks have recently become all the rage, with Games Workshop's release of their new Space Hulk terrain with box sets such as Into the Dark and the upcoming Arks of Omen's release for Warhammer 40,000. The new terrain kits are great, but they're very detailed, and you have to paint a lot of them to use in a game of Kill Team, let alone mainline 40k. It's true that you can spend very little time painting them just to get them ready for the tabletop, and there are a few videos out there which show you how to do this, but when you're spending so much money on this terrain, you might be tempted to spend a bit more time painting the details to make it look better. This is commendable, but if you're not careful, it could end up taking you an incredibly long time to get it all painted up, leading to feelings of burnout and frustration. This is something which has happened to me in the past, and it's something I'm very keen to not do again. In this video, I'm going to show you how I painted up my Into the Dark terrain in a colour scheme which very closely matches the box art used for Kill Team, using some simple techniques to get it painted as quickly as possible while still looking detailed. While this methodology isn't as quick as, say, dry brushing a single colour over a black undercoat, it's quick enough to help you maintain your sanity as much as possible. So let's head on over to the painting desk and get started. We're going to begin the process by ensuring our terrain is a nice, flat grey colour. I started by priming it with Chaos Black from Citadel, followed by a coat of Mechanicus Standard Grey. With that out of the way, I'm going to take some Nuln Oil and apply it liberally all over the terrain, but there's a couple of important points to be aware of. First of all, as you can see by the smaller pot size, I'm using the newer formulation of Nuln Oil, not the previous incarnation. If you have the previous version, it will still work just as well. The finish will just look slightly different as it tends to stain flatter surfaces more than the current formulation. Secondly, as it takes longer to dry, leave the terrain piece lying flat against the surface of your table before flipping it over and painting the other side. This will lead to a better finish than painting both sides at once and leaving the terrain standing to dry, as the wash will pool towards the bottom of the wall. There is a lot of terrain in this box set, so I recommend having another pot of Nuln Oil ready to use just in case. Make sure to leave the door open so the wash doesn't stick it shut. With the Nuln Oil fully dry, we're now going to dry brush Administratum Grey from Citadel very lightly over the entire piece to pick up the raised details, as well as add some texture to the flatter surfaces. For this step I'm using the mighty dry brush from the Army Painter, but any old dry brush will do. And that's the dry brushing step complete. We haven't worried about being too neat here, letting the paint fall where it may will add to the randomised look which will give it a more realistic feel once we finish the weathering process. Now it's time to pick out the metallic details. I'm going to be using Lead Belcher from Citadel. From this point we need to be careful not to go overboard with the amount of details we paint. I'm going to be picking out the main parts such as the pipe, the nameplate by the door and the panels, basically anything obvious. I'm going to avoid painting all the rivets at this stage as I'll be tackling those in the weathering step, and I don't want to paint all of the rivets multiple times as that will take far too long. Another thing I'll be doing to keep things quick is painting almost all of the metallic areas in Lead Belcher and maybe just one or two in a brass colour afterwards for variety. I don't want to bounce between too many colours as that will add to the length of time spent in this stage. I'm using a medium synthetic base brush from Citadel as it holds a decent amount of paint, meaning less time spent reloading the brush. It doesn't have a particularly fine tip, but it doesn't actually matter if you accidentally paint some of the areas you don't need to. Underneath the grey paint of the ship you would find metal anyway, so it just looks like the paint has worn away over time. However, if you don't like where you've accidentally spilled some metallic paint onto the model, or you think it's too much, we can always cover it up later in the weathering stage. With the details painted in, we're now going to paint the top of the wall sections in Lead Belcher as well, including the pillar caps which connect the wall sections together. Now for the purposes of this video I'm painting these pillar caps with a brush, but when I painted the rest of my collection, for speed purposes I sprayed all of the caps at once using Lead Belcher spray paint, and if you have that available to you I highly recommend you do the same. And that's basically the Lead Belcher phase complete. By using a base brush and not being too neat with it, I was able to complete the stage in very little time. In some areas the silver paint has spilled over onto the sections I didn't intend, but thankfully it's just going to add to the weathered appearance. Now, this is where we're going to deviate from the default Games Workshop colour scheme and paint the door a different colour to make it obviously different from the walls. And for that, I'm going to use Balthasar Gold, which we're going to layer on with a medium base brush again, and later dry brush it to a brighter brass colour. This will keep the door in theme with the rest of the colour scheme while making it visually distinct and easier to spot. Much of the gameplay during Into the Dark revolves around these doors, so being able to spot them from where you're playing will make your gaming experience that much easier. That's the Balthasar Gold step completed. I've painted both sides of the door and picked out a couple of details as well for a variety of colour. Now, having multiple colours and hues on terrain can make it look really good, but I've not gone overboard here as it would take too long. We're going to be getting our interesting colours predominantly during the weathering step as it's quicker to do. Before we begin the weathering step, however, I'm just going to pick out the signs and handles on the door, as well as the locking mechanism on the back in Lead Belcher. With all the metals applied, let's begin the weathering process. We're going to use Agrax Earthshade and apply it to each of the metallic areas and then across the entire lower half of the wall to make it look dirty. Again, I'm using the newer formulation of Agrax Earthshade. If you have a pot of the older stuff, it will work fine, but the finish will be slightly different. Once the Agrax Earthshade has dried, it's time to apply the rust effects on the wall. Now, I'm not one to ignore a good bandwagon, so I'm going to do what every YouTuber is now doing following Peachy's tutorial over at the painting phase, and recommend Dirty Down Rust, because it really is the best product I've used for creating convincing rust effects in one single step. There are some caveats, however, which you should be aware of before using it. Firstly, as amazing as this stuff is, it is incredibly expensive. On a per milliliter basis, it's almost 3 times more expensive than contrast paint. This stuff is also solvent based, meaning it is incredibly flammable and it gives off a strong smell. Keep this away from children and pets with sensitive respiratory systems, such as birds. Finally, if you do use Dirty Down Rust, in order to get the best results, you're going to really have to shake the bottle hard, enough until you can hear the ball bearing inside the pot rattling around. Failing to do so means you're not going to end up with the wonderful rusty textures this paint provides, in addition to the rusty colours. If you don't want to use Dirty Down Rust, I recommend using Wildwood from the Citadel Contrast paint range, or Typhus Corrosion instead. You're not going to get quite as good a rust effect, but we can improve on it in the next step to something that will resemble a final finish pretty close to Dirty Down Rust. Regardless of what you use, just splotch it onto the metallic surfaces you think should have rust and don't worry too much about neatness. Now, being solvent based, the Dirty Down Rust has dried very quickly. It's hard to make out on the camera, but in addition to the different rust colours it's left behind, it's taken on the rough texture of oxidised metal in certain places, which is great. I'm going to supplement it a bit though by using a brighter orange to pick out some of the areas. This step is optional if you've used the Dirty Down Rust, but I highly recommend doing this part if you've either used Wildwood or Typhus Corrosion. Using either Riser Rust or Troll Slayer Orange, which are effectively the same hue, dry brush onto your dark brown spots to help enhance that rust effect. A special note for people who did use Dirty Down Rust earlier, Dirty Down Rust does reactivate with moisture to a certain extent, so it's important that your dry brush is as dry as possible. To help with that, I'm going to be using Riser Rust instead of Troll Slayer Orange and making sure that my brush is very dry. With the rust now highlighted with our light orange colour, next we're going to thin down Troll Slayer Orange with some water to make it runny, and using a layer brush we're going to apply the thinned down orange into the recesses and along panels where water and grime have rusted these areas. This is basically the same technique as recess shading, albeit with a brighter colour. We're also going to pick out all of the rivets, including the smaller ones. The trick is to not be too careful with it, we're going for speed. Just a quick dab of colour applied with a small circular downwards motion will do. With that done, I hope you're up to date with your tetanus shots as we now have some very rusty looking terrain. The next step is to now brighten up the door to make it more obvious. For this, I'm going to use Brass Scorpion from Citadel and apply it with a small dry brush, taking care not to get any paint on anything but the door. Now the door is looking nice and bright, we're going to weather it using Nihilak Oxide. In a similar manner to how we used the Troll Slayer orange earlier, I'm going to paint it directly onto the rivets and any collecting surfaces towards the bottom of the door. With the door weathered, it would be perfectly acceptable to call the piece finished here if you want. However, I'm going to go a little further to add some life to the terrain and make it look a little bit closer to that studio finish. I'm going to use Wraithbone to pick out the console light here, the light bulbs up here, and the skulls, as well as the light bulbs at the back. When applying the Wraithbone to the lights, don't worry about getting the paint onto the grille in front of the light. You can paint over it later with lead belcher just to neaten up the appearance. With the Wraithbone dried, apply some Agrax Earthshade to the skulls. Next, we're going to paint the lights and console screen using Katandora Yellow. Now I'm going to apply some Mephiston Red onto the handles on the door. And the little handle over here. Apply the paint straight from the pot, taking care that you don't get any on the door itself. You don't need to completely cover up the silver in the handles, as we want to give the impression of paint that has just been worn away over time. Finally, we're going to pick out the cables that run along the walls. It's very easy to get carried away here, so in order to keep our painting time down, we're only going to use a single colour. The colour used by Games Workshop here was Cabalite Green, so that's what we're going to use as well. Again, apply it straight from the pot so you get decent coverage in one go. We've now finished painting the wall, so for the very last step I highly recommend you apply a matte varnish onto the entire thing. Now, I'm not normally the type of hobbyist who screeches when hearing of someone who doesn't apply varnish to their models. But I highly recommend it here. This terrain is going to get heavily abused, more so than other models, especially when you're trying to set up and tear down the boards due to how tight the fittings can be. Your paint will rub off if you don't varnish it, so I highly recommend that you do so. But ultimately, it's your hobby and your hobby time, so feel free to do what you want. When it comes to varnishing, personally I prefer the speed and security of applying it with an airbrush, versus painting it on with a brush, which will take far too long with the amount of terrain in these kits, or using a rattle can because that can be a little bit risky. Another benefit of using matte varnish is the matte finish that it will give to your terrain. Normally you would want to avoid doing this with metal paints because it can dull them down, but in this instance it actually adds to the worn, weathered, aged look of the piece. And there we have it, one completed wall section that resembles the studio version but with a brighter, easier to spot door. I hope this video has been of some use. If you enjoyed the tutorial and you're curious to find out how we painted the other miniatures in our collection that are featured on the channel, then you can find those on our Patreon, where as a thank you, in addition to the other benefits of being a member such as seeing videos early and gaining access to our Discord, we are adding videos each month showing how we painted up the different factions that feature in our battle reports. Please like the video if you liked it, hit subscribe if you want to see more. If you'd like to buy us a pint, drop a tip in the tip jar via the thanks button below the video. Any and all support is greatly appreciated. We'll see you all in the next video.